Josh,
Chris,
do you smell
I
what time it is?
I don't want to know what I'm supposed to be smelling, Chris.
Do you smell what Downtown Mission Church is cooking?
We just had some wrestling references beforehand. And you should have heard Chris went for it on the first record of this. It was so glorious that we decided to record again.
Yeah, for your sake.
Yeah, so if you got any wrestling fans out there, we're jazzed. We're like Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson when he was half the size that he is now back in the day. And
before everything, before life happened to him.
Yeah, we hope I guess when he was in wrestling, he probably still got paid to work out a lot. But now it's like, here's 8 hours a day, nutritionist, you get paid to be the big guy.
Exactly.
So what an interesting life.
Yeah, that is curious.
Well, welcome to A Time to Think. That's Chris Tillman. I'm Josh Holland. Chris pastors a church in Stevens Point, Wisconsin.
That is correct.
I pastor church in Wausau, Wisconsin. Together we are one church in two locations, and one of the benefits of doing that is Chris and I get to collaborate. We get to combine the signet rings like
Captain Planet, Thundercats,
Captain Planet,
Voltron, Power Rangers.
Yes.
Many options available.
There's so many ways that you can describe superpowers coming together. And so that's Chris and
what we
I.
are, superpowers coming together.
Superpowers, super humble, coming together here on A Time to Think. Chris, we are talking about a chapter in the book Digital Liturgies called The Abolition of Thought. And we thought we would embody abolishing thought by recording a podcast last week and actually not recording it. We abolished
the record button is what we did. And we abolished time. But it was beneficial for us. Because A Time to Think isn't just for you who are listening. It's for us who are speaking.
Is it more so for us?
I don't know.
I hope it's more so
No, it's more so for others.
But yeah, we recorded last week and we felt pretty good about it. And that's not every time. We don't leave every time thinking that was awesome. We were like, that was a good episode.
Yeah, many times we just question why we're even doing what we're doing.
Yeah, existence.
So, yeah.
And then we look and the record button wasn't pressed. And at that point we thought, okay, 1, bummer.
Yeah.
2, if we try to go record that same podcast, it's going to be flat and drab and regurgitated.
So we sat on it for a week and came back so that we don't even remember. Well, in fact, not only are we not remembering what we're talking about, but Josh, you don't even have your notes today. You wanted to be so fresh for this experience.
I feel naked. I'm not naked.
No,
but
you're very
I feel
clothed, as am
naked
I.
because we've gone from me having some sort of plan for the first 3 podcasts to last week, at least me having my book in front of me so that I could just read quotes, to now I have a book. It's Digital Liturgies, but it's totally unannotated. I don't know where the key quotes were. I don't have brackets. I don't have stars. I don't have anything, Chris.
Josh.
I'm nothing.
No, you're something. And see, here's the thing. In Star Wars, right? May the 4th.
Which is that a Shakespeare play?
It is. It
is
a Shakespeare play. He actually stole it from Geoffrey Chaucer. And
not Jeffrey Dahmer.
No. That's correct.
You left way too long ago. The point of making that joke is that you just keep going. No one thought it. You just made everyone think about that for 7 seconds.
See, exactly. That's because it needed to be thought about for 7 seconds as to why it was brought up.
Okay, so Star Wars.
Anyway, so Star Wars, Luke is being trained as a Jedi, which, by the way, anybody who thinks that Rey was a Jedi after being trained for about 2.8 seconds, you have a big problem.
That?
It's a joke. It's not legitimate.
Wow.
Anyways,
I don't think
the real Jedi... Sure. Luke Skywalker, as he's learning the ways of the Force, he has to kind of overcome a certain mentality where he is overthinking things. And eventually, Yoda and Obi-Wan Kenobi, a little bit previously, was just like, don't think, do.
Wow.
So, Josh.
Why?
Well, we're here. You've thought about this, so you don't need to overthink it. People who are listening may not have thought about this before. We had an entire week to think about this after what we discussed already. So we don't need to overthink this. Let's just Let's just have a good conversation where we help others take time to think.
This is the problem with me. I'm like, well, how do you do that? How do you accomplish that?
We accomplish it by doing.
Okay.
So let's do.
All right. Well,
Josh, this book, The Abolition of Thought.
The first thing I want to do is we've had a some group discussions in Wausau over the book, and there's been a couple things that have popped up that have been either things I've needed to clarify, and so I think we just clarify them here as the introduction. So the two things would be just re-engaging with what a liturgy is and what he means specifically by digital liturgies, and then a little time talking about the idea of epistemology. So that's going to be a word that most people have not encountered. It's a word that I hadn't encountered until seminary, and just, pun intended, takes a little thought to figure out what epistemology means.
There we go.
So let's dive into those two terms. First off, digital liturgies. Liturgy being something that is regular, something that's, I think, external to you, but something that shapes you.
Yeah.
So Jamie Smith, in his book, You Are What You Love, which both of us have interacted with, talks about the liturgy of the mall. You walk into the mall, it's external to you, but there's a regularity to the mall.
Correct.
Maybe a store changes here and there. Maybe there's a different place in the food court, but you walk in, you can smell the food court. There's kiosks full of useless stuff. I mean, like, you came to the mall for a thing.
Yeah.
But you have to pass 50 things you didn't need.
With
that are
phone cases and graphic T-shirts.
Yeah. and then there's salespeople at those kiosks, which God rest their souls. What a job
what a
that
horrible
is.
job.
And so there's a liturgy of the mall that you are shaped as you go in. Any more reflections on what a liturgy is?
Yeah, I think as we function within this, and we grew up in very different communities, you and I did, and around here in central Wisconsin at large, a lot of people grow up in a church context in which the idea of liturgy is associated with very bad experiences, right? If somebody is in a church context in the state of Wisconsin, there's a higher likelihood that they grew up in perhaps a Roman Catholic or a Lutheran context that didn't really even represent the idea of a living spirituality. I mean, forget whatever doctrinal issues that one might have, but the idea of a living spirituality was very absent. And so what's associated with liturgy is just going through the motions. I was surprised the short time that I was down in Louisville, Kentucky. We went to a great church, Clifton Baptist Church, and they had a liturgical approach. Now, Clifton Baptist is pastored by, eldered by, and attended by many faculty from Southern Seminary.
Yeah.
These are guys who know their stuff through and through. And so I was kind of surprised. I'm sitting in the service here at a Baptist church, and like, this feels liturgical. And what I had to kind of overcome...
But it didn't feel dead.
Correct. Didn't feel dead.
Because liturgy is a neutral term. And liturgies are infused with meaning, and really, it's the meaning that we're concerned about. So you can have a dead liturgy, and I think that's where a lot of our people come is. I'm being told to do a bunch of things that don't seem to have meaning,
right?
And that's actually the fault of the leader of the liturgy. That is not guiding you through the meaning of the liturgy. Whereas then with the mall is a liturgy that's telling you it's not really a liturgy at all. But there's still a shape and a form with a meaning attached to it. And so if you think about that, is liturgy is kind of a neutral thing, an external piece that shapes you, that there's a regularity to it that you encounter over and over again. And if you encounter it habitually, you become like it. There's always meaning behind a liturgy. And the leader of that liturgy does a good or bad job if they tell you what that meaning is, if they tell you the fruitfulness of that meaning, if they hide the meaning so you think you're not encountering the meaning. But then you get dead liturgy, dead orthodoxy kind of thing, when you're just told to do a thing without any meaning behind it.
Well, I mean, even think, for anybody who's listening right now, I mean, we're kind of past this on one level, but for you and I, when we were growing up, what was the evening liturgy with media? I mean, I remember TGIF. Thank God it's Friday. ABC. You'd have nightly news, right? Peter Jennings be on nightly news. And then starting around 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock Eastern time, which Nashville's Eastern, correct?
Nope, Central.
Really?
Yep. It's weird. Exciting. Louisville is almost directly north of Nashville, but it's... Yeah.
All right, that's odd.
It is odd.
So anyways, 7 o'clock, you would have shows come on. So you'd have like Step by Step, or you'd have Family Matters, or different shows like that would come on. And then what you'd have is after those shows run, you'd have late night TV. 10:30. You'd have different late night people on. You'd have Letterman, you'd have Leno, whatever.
From a broadcasting perspective, usually the shows get a little looser with language and content as you go on, because the assumption is that kids are not with the family liturgy has changed, right?
So 10 o'clock, you have your evening news. 10:30, you've got your your late night show. That's a liturgy. We grew up with that.
Yeah.
We had expectations that if we want to be entertained or if we want to get news, here's when it happens. And we just came to expect certain things.
And one thing that it's a liturgy is if you you were to turn on the TV at 7 and Carson was on, you would go, whoa, 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 whoa.
Right.
That is not right.
Exactly.
I spent time as a substitute teacher, and I stopped subbing at elementary schools for 2 reasons. One was I was really just trying to study for seminary, and it took a lot more work to work with elementary school students. You couldn't just like tell them to get on their homework. The second was these kids knew their liturgy, and it was on the board. And so they knew that they got in at this time, and then after 15 minutes, they had rug time, and then they had a milk time, and then there was bathroom time, and then there was recess time. And if you missed it by 2 minutes, you had a chorus of little kids telling you were doing it wrong. Now, why? Because kids thrived on rhythm, and the teacher was good at the liturgy. And you figured out what was liturgical when you did it wrong.
So really what we're trying to figure out here is what's good liturgy, what's bad liturgy, what's shaping us, what do we think isn't shaping us, which actually is, and that's really the heart of this book.
And that's where the digital piece comes in, is to say, just like the mall that you might not think about, digital engagement shapes you. One example is, it drives me bonkers, and I had to just step back and realize why I was so kind of irrationally angry, is go visit my in-laws, and their daily liturgy is the TV is on almost first thing in the morning. That is not my daily habit. And it drives me nuts. And I had to at one point say, I could argue that's a unhelpful thing to do, but it's really driving me crazy because it's not what I'm used to. And so when you look at those two liturgies, you start to think, okay, well, why do I feel the need to engage with news in the morning? It's not really because I've sat down and said that of all the options I have, engaging with the news in the morning is the best option. I've weighed all the options. It's a habit. I've become, and it would be hard not to do that. That's where you see the power of liturgies, is you're just doing something. And honestly, have you heard of decision fatigue?
Probably.
Decision fatigue is the idea that the more decisions you make in a given day, the more you want to stop making those decisions. It kind of plays out in self-control dietarily. The more you have to say no throughout the day or think about what you're eating, maybe you cave at the end of the day.
10 o'clock, it's ice cream time.
And so we don't want to sit down and deliberate for 5 to 10 minutes every time I make a decision. So most of our decisions are made on the basis of liturgy. Even something as, when do you brush your teeth? When do you...
Do you brush your teeth?
Yeah, well, that's a moral conversation. And so what James is trying to do is say, there's a thing that is everywhere all the time, in your pocket, in your hands, and it's shaping you because it's teaching you that any 10-second break you have, you need to pull it out. It needs to be the first thing you engage with in the morning and the last thing you engage with at night. If you don't engage with it, you're missing out on what's real in life. And those are liturgical shapings.
Do you know where my phone is right now, Josh?
In my hand.
No. It's on my dresser at home.
Wow.
Yeah.
Nice.
I find, and I've got some, kind of weird OCD tendencies about certain things, but it's interesting when you kind of start putting it to the test. And actually, U.S. Cellular right now has a campaign, and they're like almost rebranding Us Cellular is kind of how they're going, and they're doing this the five challenge or whatever. It's saying, put down your phone for 5 hours or 5 minutes or whatever, and engage with the people around you, because that's not us talking about the phone. So it's really interesting hearing a cell phone company capitalizing this idea of, we know that as a culture, we have become so addicted to having this thing with us all the time, shaping us as human beings, that it's starting to redefine how we engage with others. I mean, it's a cell phone company who's getting to this. And so I think, this is more than adequate in terms of timing to address the fact that we're being shaped by this pretty severely.
Yeah, you want to hear a fun story, Chris?
I'd love
to. So I've interacted probably with 5 books specifically about digital engagement in the past year. And what's been profound for me is just understanding my weakness. You would think that of all the information I've gathered, I would now be some sort of superhuman. I'd be the most self-controlled, and yet I still find myself pulling out my phone in front of my wife or in front of my kids when I could be present with them, or I still find myself anxious when it's a thing that you can't just gain more information about and fix all your problems. And in the middle of all this reading, there was one day where you were redoing the website. By the way, we have a redone website if you want to check out downtomissionchurch.com. Chris was redoing the website, and Chris texted me right as I was leaving the house and said, give me 4 book recommendations.
The books,
He gave me no context for what he needed. And because part of the digital liturgy is immediacy, part of the digital liturgy is saying it needs to happen now. You need to take care of it now. You need the information now. someone's waiting on you now. I went on a walk with my wife, and I had just had a conversation the day before of her asking me to kind of leave work aside when I can, and I was like, well, I can't text him back. But I thought about that for 30 minutes of our walk, because I had my phone with me, and I was just thinking, well, what does he need it for? Is someone waiting on this? Is it, and here's the nasty part. What if he gets a recommendation from someone else? What if like he's asking me, like, what if that's part of my identity is giving the right book?
Yeah.
And I'm going down all this rabbit, and it's because of this immediacy, digital in my pocket thing. Yep. So one practice I've started is if we go on a walk, my phone stays at home. And one of my favorite new notifications in the world is my phone is titled Baby J's iPhone. And I get on my watch, it says Baby J's iPhone was left behind.
Aww.
And it's like, cool.
Yeah.
I am now no longer tied to that thing that is shaping me to believe that everything is immediate, everything is now. So those are some reflections on liturgies. And the digital component, I also had someone ask kind of how does the book flow together? So maybe if you're feeling like there's just a lot of information, how does it flow together? Then it's chapter 1 is God has made us to live in an ordered world with his wisdom as limited, finite humans.
Yeah.
Chapter 2 is all technology shapes us, and we must ask the question, are we being shaped back into that wisdom that God created, the wisdom of presence and place and finiteness. And then chapter 3 is digital media specifically shapes our thinking.
Yeah.
So are we now thinking humanly, thinking in biblical wisdom? So that would be kind of how those first 3 chapters.
Would you say that these digital liturgies might abolish our thought process?
I would in about 5 minutes after we talk about one more term.
Interesting.
Because we want to talk about epistemology. That's the other.
Right. That's right.
That's the other.
I wasn't thinking about that when I said what I just did.
Okay. Why are you using those puns? What is epistemology? Or it looks like epistemology after 3 years of COVID-19.
Epistemology is the study of disease.
Close.
That's epidemiology.
Yep.
Epistemology is the study of thought.
Okay. So that's it? It's all we need to know?
Expand further, Josh. I've spent years. What exactly do we want to get at here?
Yeah, so why is James bringing up, he talks about the internet as changing how we're thinking. So why do you think understanding that there is a category called the nature of thought,
right? Why
would that be helpful for us as we engage with digital media?
Yeah, I mean, to this point in our culture, the idea of epistemology has typically only shown up in philosophical discussions, philosophy classrooms. I mean, I know, my not undergrad, my master's work in seminary involved history of philosophy and Christian thought, Christian apologetics, deal with epistemology, that kind of a thing. And so, typically it's a very abstract concept, even though it's probably literally as practical as you can possibly get, because you necessarily have to think about anything in order for something to be thought of. Yeah. Okay, and there's a kind of Yogi Berraism right there. You have to think about something for it to be thought of. But the reason why it's important is that we've relegated the idea of how we think to the categories of irrelevance and taken for grantedness, I think, right?
I want to say right, but I don't know what you mean. So explain it, and then I'll say right.
Yeah, reason being that, we don't give too much, and I'm not trying to pun left and right here, but we don't give too much thought to how we think, because for so long we've had categories of thought that we've operated in, at least within Western society, really for the past 200 plus years. And, we had great conversations about this with Carl Trueman's book, Strange New World, where we thought about how we process the world, right? And so there was a lot of, discussion about the way that people have come to view themselves and personal experience. And so, epistemology wasn't something we necessarily touched on in that, but it's baked into it, because there's a way that we've been taught to think for the past 200 and close to 50 years now that is now kind of being challenged by what I would say is the thoughtlessness of digital media, right? We are now in a position as a culture. Enlightenment thinking basically said, you as an individual, you are an individual, first of all. I mean, that's just a different category than some people thinking. You are an individual, and as an individual, your thoughts matter most to you and about the world around you, right?
Yeah.
And so when you engage in conversation, it's thought meeting thought when you're talking to somebody else. Well, now we don't think about thinking because we have other people thinking for us. And so in order to, think about how in the morning, right? I remember when I was in college, we got like this, we get a discounted subscription to Wall Street Journal, I think it was. You get newspapers, right? And so you would have to pick up the newspaper, you get it out of your mailbox, you'd, take it off your doorstep, and you would have to, if you wanted to think about what's happening in the world, you'd have to read it, research it, dig into it, and then you'd have to process it. You'd have whatever. Well, now we just don't think. We rely upon certain parties, and I think you and I are both guilty of this, to a certain degree. Now, we want to have trusted sources, right? But even things like how we get news now, I know for sure, if I go to Fox News, I'm going to hear one thing about President Trump's trial. If I go to CNN, I'm going to hear another thing about President Trump's trial. And it's funny because they take the exact same circumstance. Hope Hicks just testified last week, one of President Trump's, former aides. And Fox News opinion piece said, Hope Hicks' testimony as brought up by the prosecution basically sunk their case against him. CNN said Hope Hicks' testimony destroyed President Trump. I was like, which one is it?
Yeah, can it do both?
Right. Like, is that possible? Well, no, it's not possible. But what we're doing is that somebody's like, well, I want someone to tell me what I ought to think. And so opinion has replaced journalism.
Sure.
And news now has effectively...
I was actually struck... I was watching a couple videos this morning that a friend sent me, and it was, now that I'm thinking about it, it was actual journalism. I was waiting for him to tell me what was right or wrong about it. He was giving mostly statistics about the decline of like the United Methodist Church and the decline of the Church of Scotland. I was waiting for commentary, and I almost felt a lack. Like, why is he not telling me what is right? Why is he not giving me one or two sentences about what's good or what's bad here? And it was because he was doing old school journalism. He was just telling me what is happening. And that's fascinating.
There's no dipping the toe into the waters of opinion. And epistemologically, getting back to the terminology, we're no longer in the world of being individuals who think freely, right? We are now in the world of individuals who feel freely. Right, we feel freely, but we don't think freely anymore.
So interestingly, enlightenment, Chris, you're an individual. Think on your own. Modern America with technology. I'll tell you what to think.
Yep, I'll tell you what to think.
You'll think you're an individual, but I'll tell you what to think.
And if you don't think like everyone else around you, then you are guilty of consuming misinformation. Right? And so the idea of free thought, COVID was the perfect example of this. Anybody who thought freely was labeled effectively a heretic. Right? And so if you even try to form your own thoughts about COVID, or if you try to put any type of a cohesive picture together that isn't driven by talking points, you're labeled a fanatic. You're labeled somebody who's off the rocker. Just like somebody who has completely gone off the rails, because we are now at a spot, and I just saw the other day how the Biden administration has been, there are documents that have been, Freedom of Information Act request was fulfilled with documentation about the Biden administration's interaction with social media companies, and Facebook specifically, and basically how they had been, specifically during COVID-19, but I think since then as well in other areas, pressuring Facebook to censor information, pressuring Facebook to push certain information because they don't want you thinking a certain way. So when we talk about epistemology, what we're really getting at here is how do we think about the world? And what we've really come to experience now is that thought process has been eliminated. We're not teaching, even children, not teaching children how to think anymore. We're teaching them what to think. And there's a certain place for indoctrination, right? Like you want to know things that are true. But you also, I want my children to know things that are true, and I want them to get there in a way that is right, because they're going to encounter ideas about the world that aren't true, and I want them to be able to think through those ideas. And epistemology is how do we think about things? And, we don't talk about that, but now we're having to talk about it because we're fundamentally altering how we think about the world.
There's been a revolution in thinking. And so that's probably why that gets brought up. And a couple thoughts on epistemology. One, you have foundations for thinking. So this may sound silly, but the difference between myself and my dog, in general, I deliberate on,
Right. Yep.
And so even just the foundation between man and beast, there is a difference between, and people call that sentience.
Yep.
Right. There is a difference in sentience between various beings, and there's a difference between cognizance. There's a difference in thinking power, and in general, one of the big differences between a human and a beast is thinking.
Yeah.
That's actually one of the reasons why the Bible talks about humans acting in beastly ways when they're not thinking.
Thoughtless, just feeling and appetites. Right?
And so to look at the book of Ecclesiastes, there are foundations for thinking. Like humans are thinking beings, we're rational creatures. Ecclesiastes would put forth that there is something. There are many, 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 many things under the sun, and by implication, there is something above the sun, namely God. And if you do not live life in light of there being someone above the sun, then you will act like a beast.
Yeah.
So that's a foundation for thinking. So as a Christian observes this world, a Christian says one of the foundations for how I think about this world is that God made it. And so epistemology has foundations. What type of beings are we? Who created us? Even something I brought up yesterday to some friends. If someone says, Josh, what is your view on human sexuality? A Christian foundation for epistemology is to first say, I need help.
Yep. Yep.
So part of Christian epistemology is I need help to think.
Yep.
I have to go outside to revelation in order to think properly because my thinking mechanisms have been distorted by my own sinful passions.
Yep.
Or I think one of the last episodes we talked about being right or wrong for God's sake.
Yep.
Part of epistemology is knowing that I can be skewed by my own self-perception to think wrong things. Like C.S. Lewis has a discussion about what's called the inner ring, and he just talks about whether the inner ring is small, this inner ring of people that you want to be part of, whether the inner ring is small or the inner ring is big, the inner ring is in your family or in the culture. There's a desire to be in that inner ring, and he says the desire to be in the inner ring can make a not yet bad man do very bad things. Or you might think in terms of our culture, can make a not yet dumb man think very dumb things. Because we have to say part of human thinking is a push back against perception towards truth to make sure that what we're doing is... So epistemology has foundations. Epistemology also has... You have to engage in it. That's kind of a lot of what you said is we are now a thoughtless culture. It's one of the reasons we started this podcast is we felt like people were giving quick, overly passionate, ignorant opinions, and we needed to take a time to think. We had to engage in thinking in a culture that doesn't engage. So epistemology has foundations, it needs engagement. And then I think the crux of James's book is that epistemology is not just about content, but about how we think about content. It's the hyperlink example. If we have hyperlink brains that cannot sustain thought on one thing, we will naturally not think well about it.
Yeah.
So it's not even just that we're thoughtless because we're just floating in the air, but we can't sustain thought. Or with our emotions, we can't sit there and go, what if I am wrong about this? What would it mean if I change my mind about this? We have an inability there.
Yeah. We're bad thinkers. Culturally, we're bad thinkers.
So those are some reasons and some definitions behind epistemology, which brings us to the chapter 5, the abolition of thought, or the digital liturgy is called outrage. I'm going to put my book down and practice what Chris said. Don't just think, do. The basis of that chapter is that anger is a bad way to think, and that social media often fuels anger. He quotes Proverbs saying, the one who states their case first seems right until another comes and examines him.
Yeah.
And he talks about James. The anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. And so that's kind of an example of how we take that wisdom from chapter 1, God saying, when you think angrily, you don't produce righteousness.
Right.
And then we take the liturgy of the culture, which says, think quickly and angrily, and we say, those do not mesh together. Your thoughts?
It's sad, Josh, because I feel like as Christian people, we fall prey to the same temptations that non-Christian people do in terms of the categories of temptation. And it is sad to me. And I was talking with Rosalie yesterday about a particular politician who bills herself as this Christian individual, and she attends an evangelical church in the state where she's a politician. And it was really sad to me as I was talking with her, because I'm like, here's a woman who has billed herself a certain way, and she's carried herself behaviorally in another way, and how she's representing herself as a Christian person in media environments tend to be, I would say, probably the best word is bombastic, right? And so how she comes across as bombastic, and it's reaction driven. It's oriented around, like, here's how I feel about this thing.
Yeah.
And so we have this, like, it's a marriage, and quite frankly, this is one of the things that just it really, really, really irks me, because Christian people ought to be thoughtful people, right? Even if we disagree vehemently with somebody, right? Like this individual, I might share similar views in certain ways,
Okay.
with how she might view a particular political issue, but the way that she processes things, the way that it comes across, it's driven by outrage. It's driven by anger. It's driven by thoughtlessness. It's driven by a desire to be heard, instead of driven by a desire to actually get it right, and get it right the right way. And so I think that's something that I've observed when it comes to
Well, because outrage sells.
Right.
The old slogan used to be sex sells.
Right.
There's actually some decent research that it doesn't.
Sure.
Like the Hardee's commercials missed the boat.
Oh man,
Yeah,
no,
they're bad.
Yeah,
But there is a truth behind outrage sells, because here's what outrage does. Either I viscerally say, yeah,
Yep.
or I viscerally say, no.
Exactly.
And either way, I'm still watching.
exactly.
I don't get bored. Boredom doesn't keep you. Now, if
Right.
we think to both social media, we think to advertising on websites. Advertising on websites is based on page clicks,
Yep.
which means the website is designed to get you to click more.
Yeah.
It's designed to keep you.
Yep.
TV news is designed to keep you. I've showed you guys the underbelly every once in a while. TV news in
Put your
its
shirt back on,
in its
Josh.
structure, not my underbelly, the underbelly of the beast. It's designed to keep you.
Yep.
There's a whole theory about inertia in how you talked about that liturgy of 7 to 10 p.m. There's a theory behind how you schedule different things and how you put shows will get good ratings on the bookends of show that might not
Yep.
do as well, because in general the person is like, I don't want to make a change. So you can, if you try to keep them on one channel as long as possible, all of this is about keeping your attention.
Yes.
And that inertia is driven oftentimes in the news cycle by outrage, because it keeps your attention.
Yep.
Long form thoughtful discourse, unless you're listening to A Time to Think, doesn't also always keep your attention. You get bored and you turn off. And so outrage sells. I can distinctly remember in college where the former Cold Pizza with Stephen A. Smith and Skip Bayless turned into First Take, and I watched it every day. And then there was
Did they ever argue, Josh?
at first it was good. I watched it every day because I was like, oh, this is something to be sought after.
But then
there was a turn.
Yeah.
I don't know if it was 2012 or 2013. There was a turn where they were just shouting. They were always talking about if it was LeBron or Jordan. They were always, because it was always something that had to tick people off. And that has become much of the digital engagement.
Have you listened to Stephen A. lately? His podcast?
He seems to be engaging with some interesting cultural things on his podcast.
It's very interesting because it's no longer Stephen A. being Stephen A.
Right.
It's Stephen A. actually being Stephen A.
Yeah.
And he's thinking out loud. And it's been really fascinating to see a guy who does think a lot and who's very valid as a cultural commentator.
He's a good example because him and Skip Bayless both, at least Skip, I know, went to Vanderbilt.
Which you don't like,
okay,
Josh, do you?
I don't like them because Tennessee is their older brother and their little brother. But Vanderbilt's a good school.
Sure.
Vanderbilt's probably one of the best academic schools in the South, certainly in the state of Tennessee. Back in the day, to go to Vanderbilt and to get a job at a newspaper writing sports columns, you had to be a smart person.
Sure.
You'd be a thinking person, an original person.
Yeah.
And so both Stephen A. and Skip did that.
Yeah.
That back in the day, in the 70s and 80s, they went to good universities. They got, I think Stephen A. was at the Philadelphia Inquirer. So you're talking about being a sports journalist. You're talking about a top 10 job in the country for a sports journalist. You got to be a smart dude.
Yeah.
But then TV changes.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, it's not valued to be smart.
Yep.
It's not valued. It's valued to win.
Yep.
And so when we reflect on the culture, it's like that the higher value, the higher priority is on outrage and winning. I think I gave this example in past podcasts, but it's why in a Facebook comment thread, someone can say this argument, and then you say, yeah, but, and you present a fine point, and then they change the argument because it's not actually about engaging the thought. It's about winning.
Yeah.
And you see that in ad hominem attacks of personal character, all these different things. It's about winning and outrage.
Yeah.
We'll get more into the ad hominem in the next podcast on shame. But social media tends to drive us toward outrage in terms of thinking, and that's why James is saying it's abolishing our ability to think. He then presents the opposite of that. He gives 3 Christian examples of thinking. As I'm flipping there, I believe he says Christian thinking is thoughtful.
Yep.
Christian thinking is careful. Is that right? And Christian thinking is communal.
Yes.
No. Christian thinking
communal's
is
part of it. Yep.
truthful.
Truthful.
So careful, truthful. So careful is that thoughtful piece. Careful, truthful, and communal.
Yeah.
We've kind of talked a little bit about the careful piece. Once again, that's where he goes with the one who states his case first seems right until the other comes and examines him. And I think maybe I shared with you last week, Chris, a humbling moment I had where I was walking around a property for ministry leaders down in Plainfield, Wisconsin, and I was given a task by a mentor to just think whatever comes to mind for 30 minutes. I'm walking around, and my first thought is, well, I want to have good thoughts when we come back together. And I was like, well, why do you want to have good thoughts? That's a weird desire to have. Like, you're trying to impress them with your thoughts that came to mind. So I'm just going, okay, whatever comes to mind. And then I passed a guy who has some sort of ecology degree. I know this guy knows more than me about nature, and he's looking at a tree. Turns out he's actually looking at a bird, so I didn't even have a thought of what he was actually doing. But what dawned on me is, there's a ton that I don't know.
Yeah.
And I'm in a position to talk a lot. And I find most comfort when I'm talking. But there's a ton, and then I walk into this cabin, and I look up, and there's deer antlers, and I think, I don't really know anything about hunting. I look over, and I'm looking at this kind of pretty cool cabin, and I think, I would have no idea how to build this. I look over at a piano, and I'm kind of around a bunch of musicians, and I think, I can't play that. I don't know how to play. And there was just this humbling moment of saying, I don't know a lot, and maybe I should be slower to speak then.
Wasn't it Socrates who said, all knowledge consists in knowing that we know nothing?
Is that?
I think that's what Socrates said.
Okay, there's a truth there, but the digital liturgy says you can know everything, and therefore speak quickly.
Yep.
So one thing when you think about Christian thinking being careful is we need to have the humility to step back and say, if I give my gut reaction, it's probably at least partially wrong.
Sure.
If not mostly wrong.
Unless I actually know what I'm talking about, right?
So it's smarter for me to wait and observe, smarter for me to wait and calm down and be careful. Thoughts on Christian careful thinking?
You know, I want to really transition into this next talking point, so I'm just going to say this. I think careful thinking happens communally.
Okay.
So I do mean that because, yesterday began preaching the book of Titus, and I made a point of saying to the people in Stephen's Point, I said that this is a book that's written to an individual, but it's intended for the church, right? And so the greatest way to understand, Titus's whole message is get the gospel right so you can live right, basically. I mean, that's a kind of a really distilled view of the book. But this happens within community, right? You can tell whether or not you're getting things right in your practice of godliness when other people are witnessing it and other people are benefiting from it. So if you are thinking properly about things, right? There's, it's really, really strange that we do live in, and I think modern evangelicalism is very much I wouldn't say just like a fallen victim to, I think it's one of the main perpetrators among Christian people of thoughtlessness and carelessness in how we think. Modern evangelicalism pretty much told people, well, as long as you feel something sincerely, you're fine. I mean, it's given into the feelings-based mentality, and there's nothing wrong with feelings. Feelings are fantastic, but John Frame, who taught at RTS, I think he left before you started, talks about kind of the tri-perspectival approach towards knowledge, and you have a normative, then you have like a situational, and then you have an existential. Basically, three different aspects of it, and far too often, like what we experience is this just experience-based approach,
which is the existential, right?
Yes.
Normative would be back to that idea that epistemology has foundations.
Yes.
There are norms, like God created Josh.
Yes.
Josh needs revelation from God. That would be
exactly.
normative. Situational, is that like experiences in life, things you've seen, or remind me what
no,
situational?
so situational is, I think. So it's three perspectives, and he applies it in all different types of areas of life. But I think it would be the setting in which the thing occurs.
Okay.
Right. So the situation in which something
and then
occurs
existential is the feeling component.
Is the feeling, yeah. So where was I going with that? Yeah, modern evangelicalism, the way that we tend to operate is that we force this idea of feeling. And as we feel our way through things, we're not teaching each other through Scripture. Right? Scripture commands that the word of Christ dwell among you richly. Right? Ephesians 4 says, speak the truth in love. Now, speaking of truth and love isn't going up to somebody and being like, hey, I see this about you and I like this. That's part of it. But speaking the truth in love in that context has everything to do with having the word of Christ, because it's correlative to Colossians. The word of Christ dwelling among you richly, so that, as that passage unfolds further in Ephesians, that you might mature into the fullness, the stature of Christ.
Yeah.
Like the whole point of Christian
not be
thought,
tossed around.
Yeah, don't be tossed around. Every wind and wave of doctrine comes around. It's like, oh, well, this, and then this, and then this, and then this. You grow together, and that's why Paul says that Christ gave the church these different gifts. And why pastor teachers exist today is to equip the saints for the work of ministry. And part of the equipping is teaching how to think and think God's thoughts after him, right? And so this happens in community. You don't just do this on your own. There's a reason why, and this is not a self-justifying statement, but there's a reason why we are employed in doing what we do, is because the Lord has found it good that he should order his church in such a way that there are some men given to the task of shepherding people through the word. Yeah. We shepherd through the word. We don't shepherd as Christian men, just like we just come up with ideas. Through the word, we understand what our job is, and then we understand how we help people walk with Jesus. And that all happens through truth statements communicated through Scripture, and then that flows through the life of the church. That's how we know a church is healthy, is if Scripture is informing how we live.
Do you think thinking is more important in a pluralistic, multicultural culture than it would have been, say, in Israel? Like the idea of because I'm thinking as we're talking that you want to avoid the idea of like an elitist class where only the elite can think. But there is a reality of role. Just like in the church, you have kind of preachers, you have Bible study leaders. There's a function and a role where some people like us are given to more time to think. Yeah. So then we can do a podcast like this where we can say, here's what we've been thinking about. Yeah. So that the person who needs to go work out as an auto mechanic or as a school teacher who doesn't have the ability to read what we can read, those types of things, they can still think, but in a way that's helped. Yeah. Do you think that is more necessary today? I'm in particular thinking about pro-Palestine protests. You think about this is a product of a multiculturalist culture, but also some kind of oppression dynamics and different philosophical ways of thinking about the world. And for the average person, you're going, what is going on? But because we're not in a unified Israel, not current Israel, but in the past where it was God's theocratic system, it requires even more thinking because there's more things happening from more different directions. And that maybe is leading to some Christian confusion and exhaustion these days, is because we have to think way more than we did circa 50 years ago.
Yeah, I think
is that on base or off base?
I think it's on base on a certain level. So I think that it's equally applicable, equally important. You look at what is the commandment that God gives when it comes to Scripture. He's speaking to a people who are, I wouldn't say illiterate, but he's speaking, you think 4,000 years ago, there's no printing press. But what does the Lord command his people to do? Write. Right? He says, write down my word. You write it. And he says, like, literally, keep it in front of your eyes.
Yeah.
Hide it in your doorpost. I mean, I think to this day, there's some Jewish homes where they will actually, in the lintel doorpost area, they'll have little scrolls of scripture. Okay. They'll tuck it in there because the Lord's command has always been, keep my word in front of you.
Yeah.
Psalm 119, longest chapter in the Bible, is all about your word is my, David says that I'm more learned than my instructors because of your word.
Yeah.
So in first, the first place we find this type of, command to think is the Bible itself.
Yeah.
It's right there. But I think the reason why it's a little different for us today in terms of how we think about this is that the challenge in, Old Testament Israel, the challenge then was the pluralism of the outside, right? Shaping how we think. And so Israel had a certain type of privileged bubble, as it were, that made it very clear to determine who's in and who's out. Now, they obviously
didn't do it well.
Didn't do it very well at all.
Yeah.
And so they accepted outward ways of thinking, but there was always a norm. There was always a standard. It was always like, okay, is this, can you test this against this? The problem that we face right now is that we don't have a cultural standard, right? Our cultural standard is a free for all. Just do whatever you feel like. Think whatever you feel. That's fine. Just do it yourself.
Yeah.
And so the way that we think now as Christian people is still the same method as you're going to find in the Old Testament, would have found 4,000 years ago. But the place that it's applied is different. And I would say, maybe it's a little too strong of a term, but the threat of competing thoughts. And competing thoughts are obviously fine because what's true is true. Like, I have no problem with competing thoughts. That's why we talk about this and do what we do. But the threat of competing thoughts is much more prevalent, so that nobody's actually giving you the objective standard. And quite frankly, 50 years ago, it would have been a lot more similar to 4,000 years ago in terms of Israel, the collective standard. You think about, we're a Judeo-Christian nation, right? We're just not that anymore. We're a post-Christian nation. We are not a nation that people are not raised in the church anymore. Sadly, they're not. It brings different liabilities either way, but now how we think about things isn't governed by a standard that everybody agrees to.
What's the old saying, like, something like strong men make strong culture, but strong culture can make weak men. And it's like a progression from, it takes a strength to make the culture, but once the culture gets strong, you can get lazy.
Sure. Yep.
And then the laziness of that weakens that culture, which, and I think about that with when the West is largely Christianized, there's less of a urgency to know the biblical foundations for epistemology.
Yep.
And then you do that for 30 years, all the while the cultural foundations of what is morally acceptable, widespread, is eroding. And now you find yourself in a place where many people growing up didn't have their parents saying, you got to know these foundations from God's word.
Exactly.
And because evangelicalism did not prize doctrine and thought.
Yep. And it's eschewed it. It hasn't just not prized it. It's actually deprioritized.
Well, you think of head knowledge versus heart knowledge.
Yeah, Doctrine divides, Christ unites, right?
Yeah, the Christian says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, which means head knowledge and heart knowledge, if you want to use those categories, I don't think they're helpful, but if you want to use them, they lead both to worship.
Yep.
When we think rightly, we worship rightly, which engages our heart and our soul. But as 20, 30 years of eschewing, devaluing, overlooking, thinking about the foundations of Christianity, then you have the cultural foundations eroded, and now Christians have to rethink again, and there's an urgency, which means an ability to recapture things, but it's going to take time. It's going to take thought. It's going to take that communal thinking as well, because none of us are infinite. None of us are able to do all things, and so we have to think together. The last thing that James talks about is that Christian thinking is truthful. And he says that sounds like a duh statement, but he brings out a story from John chapter 5 where Jesus has performed a miracle of healing a man who hasn't been able to walk. And then instead of people saying, this is amazing, that man is God, there's a particular group of Jews who, instead of following and worshiping Jesus, wants to kill him. They want to kill him because the reason he healed the man who couldn't walk is because Jesus wanted to say, only God can do that.
Right.
Implication, I am.
Right.
one with the Father. I am God. And so these Jews want to kill him because he claims to be equal with God. He breaks customs on the Sabbath. And Jesus, responding to these Jews, they've seen something. Now, let's say you don't believe in miracles. Just assume they saw it.
Yep.
The Bible says they saw it. So part of the story is they saw the miracle.
Yep.
And they didn't respond by thinking that's a miracle worker. They respond with, we need to murder him.
Yeah.
That's an irrational response.
Right.
Right? It's not responding based on the data available.
Yeah.
And Jesus' response to them is, I have come in my Father's name, and you do not receive me. If another comes in his own name, you will receive him. How can you believe when you receive glory from one another and do not seek the glory that comes from the only God? James goes on to say, Jesus could have attributed the unbelief of this group to many things: jealousy, resentment, even ignorance. Instead, Christ says that they come to him in faith, that coming to him in faith is prevented by the fact that they want glory from each other. And so James is trying to say Christians have to always remind ourselves that one of the purposes, the motivations for our thinking is to find what is true, not to find what makes us look good.
Yeah.
Now, the communal piece helps because we can find what's true in a community that will support us.
Sure.
But we have to make sure that as we're looking at a surrounding culture, we're not seeking to find what is going to give us progress in the eyes of people. We got to find what is true, even if it leads towards persecution, even if it leads towards slander, even if it leads towards many other things.
Yeah.
So Christian thinking is not quick and passionate and angry. Christian thinking is careful, truthful, and communal. So that was the digital liturgy of the abolition of thought. We'll engage on the next podcast with the cultural liturgy of shame. So we're going to talk about what is it, cancel culture. What does it look like for thought to be changed by the shaming of the personal attacking of one another? So that'll be next time on A Time to Think.